we now see already live streaming.
Okie doke, all sorted. Everyone can see the slides, hopefully.
Yes, you can start, cool. And we see your screen. Thank you, Robbie. You have
great. Well, thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending on where in the world you are, to hear a bit more about a project that a few of us have been working on over the last probably months, although I guess the idea stretches back probably a bit more than a few months. The Open Information Security Risk Universe, or Oisru to its friends. Myself, I'm Robin Oldham. Also going to be joined in the background by Phil Huggins.
Hey.
And Petra as well.
Hi.
So objectives of the session today, we're going to give you a bit of an intro to the Open Information Security Risk Universe, give you a chance to apply it to some previous incidents and worked examples, and explore a few of the other use cases that you want. And if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat, or yeah, that's probably the best place to put them. Bit of a warning to you all, there is audience participation ahead. As you heard in the video, you know, there'll be some things for you to get involved in and to try your hand at. So please do get involved when we come to those. And vaguely the plan then, we've got quite a long session. The Open Security Summit affords us quite a lot of time. You're not trying to cram everything into necessarily into a 20-minute or a kind of 45 or an hour long presentation. So we've got a couple of hours this afternoon, broadly two halves. So the first half, we're going to talk you through the universe, what's the problem we're solving, what are the components, and take you through one of the use cases. Then you're going to have a chance to put it into practice through a bit of a group exercise and present back. And then in the second half, we're going to go through some of the other use cases, so around risk coverage, bow tie diagrams, and graphs. And we're going to hopefully leave plenty of time for questions. And crucially, we'd also be interested in your feedback when we get to the end. So hopefully we can stick roughly to that sort of schedule. Give myself 30 minutes either way. I think that's probably doable. So where to start? Obviously, if we're talking about universes, there's got to be a bit of a gratuitous space photography involved as well, and some lighthouses to keep Phil happy as well. So not space, but risk, the final frontier. Traditional sort of risk identification methods. You might run a workshop or an exercise. You'd ask managers and other colleagues from around the business to identify their major risks. You end up with the creation of loads and loads, huge unmanageable set of risk scenarios and registers. It can be quite difficult to know when and where to stop. You don't want to stop people from contributing. Maybe you've got other things that overlap. And describing everything in the known universe is a pretty hard ask, right? And understanding all those different permutations of what might happen and how it might affect your business can be quite difficult. So the same is absolutely true of information security risk. And to sort of give you a bit of an example here and a bit of early audience participation here, we've got a snippet from an example risk register. Anyone like to volunteer what might be wrong with some of these, some of the risks on this risk register? Just a reminder, your unmute button is in the bottom left of the Zoom window.
It depends whose these are. Are these supposed to be at a very high level, board level?
You can decide, Tony. What would you you've obviously got something.
The lack of information there would put it as a yes.
It's not quantified.
Not quantified. Okay, so by that, are you getting it? There's no kind of, it doesn't articulate what it is that actually happens. Or
well, I mean,
doesn't mean anything.
What's the cost, and therefore what do you do to, what's the cost of mitigation? Nothing, doesn't help.
Yeah, there's quite a few things here, right? So you know, we've got things that are expressed as risk factors or controllable factors. We've got events. We've got there's no restriction on overlaps and things like that. There's no differentiation made between what's a risk and what's a control or a control failure. Overall, not a great place to start from, but it's not a million miles off where many people find themselves when it comes to doing risk assessments or inheriting risk registers that might have been done before they joined the organization or have been done by you know, other practitioners or teams or something like that. It can be a real mishmash of scenarios that you inherit. So the problem then, or rather what we're trying to solve is to define a way of doing risk identification, a risk universe consisting of a finite set, a comprehensive set of mutually exclusive and kind of therefore not overlapping risk classes. And you can use hard or soft data to kind of reveal where that might be within your organization, where are the losses taking place, what's driving those, and what exists. So try and avoid those kind of, everything having its own line in a risk register and making it really difficult to aggregate or roll up, avoiding poor risk statements, make, the difficulty to compare like for like or to check your coverage. So introducing the Open Information Security Risk Universe, or as I said, Oisru to its friends. Phil comes up with nothing if not a snappy acronym for for things. A model and kind of method independent framework, a taxonomy for expressing and categorizing, communicating different sorts of information security risk, ideal for budding astronauts or InfoSec pros. And we talked a little bit about risk identification there. Obviously, that's kind of this is borrowed from. Oh, hang on a minute, that's a bit dry. And there we go, that's better. So you'll likely be familiar with kind of risk management as a cycle, and people often talk about doing risk assessment, then risk treatment or management, and kind of monitor, review, and cycling around. Actually, for assessment, decomposing that, we can break it into kind of risk identification, what may go wrong, the risk analysis piece, how may it affect us, and what might the negative outcomes be, how severe might they be, how frequently might they occur, and then risk evaluation. So what are you actually going to do about it? Do you care enough to do anything? Is it acceptable to the business? So the Oisru gives you a structured approach to risk identification and a way to keep yourself kind of grounded and oriented as you're going through identifying different scenarios. At its core, it's these sorts of components. So we've got a whole load of sources, the actors or instigators that may lead to cyber risk, events and the kind of conditions that need to be present in order for that risk to be realized, and consequences, the possible harms that presumably you want to avoid in your world. And there's a couple of kind of supplementary bits, kind of things to consider and guide you around. A set of frequency factors that might affect how often an event occurs, and severity factors that may drive the level of consequence that you experience in your organization. All making sense so far? Everyone following along all right? I can't see the chat, so I don't know whether anyone's asked any questions or anything. Thumbs up, cool. Thank you very much. And so, sources, we've included a bit of a classification simply as internal versus external, malicious versus non-malicious. The events largely drawn, before we started, we were talking a little bit about ENISA, drawn from a review that they did of all the European CSIRTs, incident response teams, and how they categorized incidents. So again, internal or external, where external might be outside the scope of your control. Good example there, I suppose, would be regulatory change. You might be trying to influence that by lobbying, but largely it's outside of your organization. A simple hierarchy to help group them, and a bit of consideration for the good old CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then consequences. So be that operational, compliance, financial, strategic, all the things that that might impact your business as a result. So that might be disruption to your business. It might be an environmental harm that occurs or a safety harm as a result. And what I'm not going to do right now, because it would make for a really, really boring talk, is to go through all of these individually. But later on, we're going to give you the link, and when you get the slides, these are linked off from the top here that you can go and have and explore through all of those different aspects. So you can decompose your risk scenario into these sources plus events plus consequences, and it gives you that structured way of looking at it. And it's important to not forget that you can always have more than one in any part of that chain. For example, you might have cyber criminals as a source. The event might be a combination of ransomware and an information breach, where those sorts of events nowadays, not only are they encrypting your data, but they're also taking copies before they do the encryption. And then the outputs, the kind of the consequences of that action would be business disruption. You may end up with regulatory fines as a result of losing personal data, for example. So you can have multiples of each of these chained together in that form a certain scenario. Everything okay so far? Following along?
Yes.
Good. Cool. So what are the use cases then? How have we been applying them to date? So there's a bit here around writing good risk statements and drafting risk scenarios and improving the kind of example register that we talked through earlier. But as well as that, you can use it for other use cases as well. So, for example, exploring scenarios through bow tie diagrams, checking coverage of your risk assessment and comparing and contrasting different scenarios. And also one of the things that we've been looking at right up until today, that we can have some exciting new additions to the deck in how you might link this into other data via graphing and those sorts of modern techniques. But we're really interested to know the sort of use cases that people might see for this kind of approach. Please feel free to grab hold of me or Phil on Twitter to do so. For the moment, though, I wanted to stick with the first use case because that's probably the most kind of common use that we've had to date. And then we'll give you an opportunity to kind of put that into practice. Before I do, a little bit on risk scenarios versus risk statements, without wanting to sound too pedantic about language and the differences between them. So risk scenarios should provide some level of business context. They're more likely to be in a kind of narrative form and be used where you're communicating with other stakeholders. So that might be other colleagues around the business. It might be as part of presenting up to a board. And they're generally going to take a richer picture and a greater example of how something might manifest within your specific organization. And that aids with understanding in the same way that we were discussing in the threat personas and application vulnerability scoring session earlier in the week. On the other side, risk statements provide a more structured approach. They aid easier comparison between different statements and are more useful for practitioner communication. So assuming that most of the people here are from an InfoSec or have a knowledge of an InfoSec background, where we talk about, I was doing it a second ago, talking about cyber criminals and ransomware and regulatory fines, that immediately means something in your head. If you're a director of a particular business unit, you probably don't understand exactly what you mean by cyber criminals, their level and kind of the skills and capabilities that they have. When it comes to ransomware, they may not understand exactly what that would entail. And obviously when it comes to regulatory fines, they may not know the exact size and shape and scale that those might manifest as. So risk statements are a kind of good shorthand way for practitioners to communicate. And so an example of that here then over a lovely image from the Hubble Space Telescope. We've got a risk scenario, an accidental market sensitive information leak. So during the reporting period, a member of the accounting team under pressure accidentally sends a draft of the annual report to an employee at our technology outsourcer who has the same name as our CFO. As a result of the address autocomplete in their email software, curses. If the draft leaks, it could lead to market sensitive information being published ahead of the publication of the report, which leads to regulatory sanctions and trigger insider trading investigation. That's a pretty well fleshed out scenario that you could talk through with your CFO or member of the board, and they would understand what you're talking about. At its core, you're talking about employees and information breach, regulatory fine, damage regulator relations as being the kind of statements, the components that we draw from the open information security risk universe. Is that all making sense thus far?
Yes.
Cool, good.
A question. So
yeah,
on the risk statement, would those be? Is that how that would be published or drawn? Let's say shown to other people as the 3 different parts.
So I think you're going to need a little more than that if you're trying to communicate it at its essence. Those are the kind of key parts. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily, going back to our register as an example, expect to see a line that said employee plus information breach plus regulatory fine and have a big A+ next to it. But it's just kind of distilling it down into those particular components. It might be something that you want to track as attributes relating to a certain scenario in your register, for example, the source, the event, and the consequences, to aid you in your analysis and kind of mapping between those different scenarios.
Yep, thank you.
Good question. Anyone else? Excellent, good. Well, we got going really promptly because we had the video in the run-up to the start at 2 o'clock. Oh, sorry.
Robin,
yep.
We have a question from Martin on the chat.
Okay.
Are you intentionally separating primary and secondary losses?
So this is agnostic of any kind of assessment or analysis approach you might take. So primary and secondary losses, I'm guessing you're coming at it from a fair perspective in that kind of question. And so that's not a thing that we are necessarily considering here. It's just identifying the consequences that may occur. But it certainly lends itself to mapping onto those sorts of analysis methods, those kind of assessment methods. Again, good question.
Martin says thanks.
Thanks, Martin. When you're presenting, I can see all your faces, but I can't see the chat window for some reason. I'm sure there must be a way to do it, but I won't worry too much about that at the moment. So what we were hoping to do is to put you all into groups and make use of the breakout room functionality. And each group is going to get a different historic security event. And we'd like you to put yourself in the risk manager's shoes prior to the event and kind of do a bit of reverse engineering and write a risk statement and a scenario that, that can apply. I am going to copy and paste these links into the chat window if I can find it. There we go. Yeah, hopefully we can get everyone randomly assigned into, how many people have we got on at the moment? 20. So if we could have 4 groups, I think that's probably a good number. Are we able to get everyone randomly assigned into 4 breakout rooms, please?
I have never have these breakout rooms. Let me check.
And then, so there's a separate, while we're waiting for that, there's a separate deck that you should be, oh, there's a couple of you found it already. And so for each breakout room, there's a different slide with a scenario, and then, yeah, some sticky notes to help you on your way. I'll pop round between a few of the breakout rooms to see how you're all getting on, and yeah, we'll reconvene probably in about 15 minutes, I think.
Do you see now the message for breakout rooms?
Yes, thank you. Yep. I'm going to need your help, I think. I think I can join breakout room 1, and then if I come back here, I think you might have to put me in breakout room 2, which I think you can do by right-clicking on me as a participant.
Yes, I can do that, but yes.
Yeah. So I'll pop round. I'll pop back here, and then you can reassign me, and I'll just check that everyone's getting on all right.
Okay, just let me know.
Yeah, will do. Thank you very much.
Yes, Robin, you are in mute.
Oh, there we go. Hi. It must mute me when I rejoin. Could you put me into breakout room 2, please?
Yes, here you go. Is it working?
Not yet.
Yeah, I see, but I see
Oh,
you.
there we go. Yeah, no, it's just come through. Thanks.
Thank you.
And breakout room 3, please.
Okay, doing.
Hello,
Hey, Cam, how you doing?
I'm well. Robin, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good.
Is this breakout room 3?
No, this is the main one. Are you meant to be in breakout room 3?
I am. I left because I didn't have any of the links in the breakout room, so I've got them, so I could be sent back now. I'm not sure how to do that though.
If you hit the breakout rooms button, Cam, at the bottom of it should give you.
Oh, yeah, seen.
Room 3.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Cheers.
I see someone. Oh, okay.
And breakout room 4, please.
In breakout.
We lost Alan from the breakout room 1, and I lost myself from breakout room 1. So should we all come back there to breakout room 1?
I can. I don't see you, Petra. I can move with this breakout room, but you are in room 1.
I would love to go back to breakout room 1, but it's not giving me the option. It's only
I think Alan just needs to be assigned to breakout room 1, and then they can both go back there.
Yeah.
You've done this before.
Okay. I move Alan to breakout room 1. This is very interesting job.
and me as well.
You are there, Petra.
Once you've been assigned,
Say
you
again?
need to press the breakout room button in order for it to pop up the join button for you. Oh, there we go. Are you able to pop me into breakout room 4, please?
But in breakout room 4, there is nobody.
There should be, because there are people editing breakout room 4 on the slide deck.
Okay, let me move to there, and you will tell us what you see.
I'll see whether there's anyone there.
So, Martin, Avi, are you in a main room or you are in breakout rooms? Robin, you come back to main. Did you see someone in breakout room 4? You are in mute.
I think it's just a couple of people that have decided to split off from one of their groups and do something independently. So that's fine.
Which room you want to go now?
No, I'm all right. I'm going to hang here and see whether anyone's got any questions as they're going along.
Yeah, I didn't. Robin, now I don't see the breakout rooms. Is it okay? Oh, okay. I see it. I see it. Okay. Robin, you are in mute. We cannot hear you.
Avi and Martin, are you guys all right? Are you? Or have you got other things that are keeping you busy?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just in and out. I'm working in parallel. I'm passively listening. Thanks.
Okay.
Avi, do you want to join any of the rooms?
Not right now. Thanks.
Okay. Just let me know. I'm already expert there.
Yeah, as Martin says, busy with other things too.
It's,
Didn't want to miss anything else.
gives you a bit of a throw you in at the deep end there with the running breakout rooms.
How many minutes we have still, Robin?
I'm just having a look at how they're getting on at the different slides. I think breakout room 2 are doing all right. Breakout room 3 probably need another few minutes. I think I'll give you a shout. I think probably in 2 minutes' time we'll start to get everyone back.
Okay.
Cheers. Okay, if you can press recall, I think it gives them 60 seconds to rejoin.
Okay, so 60 seconds.
Yep.
1 minute. I think live streaming is not supporting breakout rooms, so might be we had power
Yeah, I think there's probably going to be a good 20 minutes of not much happening on the live stream. But
yeah, but I hope it is not a problem.
have you recalled everyone from the breakout rooms? There we go. That should. I think it gives them a minute before they get pulled back, regardless of whether they've pressed rejoin or not.
Yeah, I think now, yeah, 45 seconds remaining.
Yeah, I can see people typing frantically in boxes on some of the other slides, so they're obviously just finishing up.
Cool.
There we go. Like it or not, your time's up. Welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen again. And was going to, so I hope you found that an interesting and useful exercise. We've spent probably about 25 minutes on it, so plenty of time for people to have a good discussion. What I was intending to do now was just to get people's thoughts and feedback and talk through the different examples that we've had and scenarios so people can see it in action. So do we have a volunteer from breakout room number 1 who'd like to tell us a bit about what you got up to and your example?
I'm happy to be the voice piece unless Petra wants to go, or indeed Louis. There were 3 of us in breakout room 1, some technical challenges, but the content and the process was clear. We have filled in both the slide that you gave us, and we have a graph as the next slide, I think, that should be visible to you.
Cool. Yeah, you got to cheat a little bit because Petra had obviously helped us putting some of these together and worked up a couple of other bits and pieces here. So we'll come on to some of the other kind of graph uses of this kind of thing as well. So do you want to talk us through your example, what you ended up with?
So yes, of course, and we were using our memories as well as reading the Wired article.
Yeah.
So Louis quite correctly corrected us in terms of initially I was thinking ransomware because I was thinking WannaCry. Then we remembered, hang on, no, it was a destruction of servers unavailability. There was no ransom aspect to NotPetya, so we corrected that. We've added in the consequences, and I think one of the things we were mindful of was the business disruption was over 60% of Maersk's global trade stopped. They had to revert to paper systems. It was public knowledge. And indeed is a very useful case study subsequently. All of that I think we have captured here, not the least of which, in fact, I think we're wrong. The third-party compromise, no, not third-party compromise was correct. That was through. So we think we pulled out the headlines and have shown them both here and then on Petra's graph as an illustration of the process.
Cool, good stuff. Yeah, and thank you very much, Alan. Anyone from breakout room 2 who was in the Equifax group would like to talk through how you found that and what you've got as your resulting scenario and statement? Do we have anyone from breakout room 2 left, or have they all given up and gone?
Yeah, I think you've probably got a few of us.
I'm here.
Trying to work out how to unmute.
Are you going to take this one, Simon?
Yeah, happy to. So we spent a little bit of time trying to describe the risk scenario in a way that we thought the business would understand, and started with that. Good point was made that actually we might come back to that once we've been through the kind of the structured approach to the source, event, and consequence. So yeah, probably a little bit of value in that. So we set the scene in the scenario, but also talked about the risk and the potential consequences, or the kind of the event and the potential consequences in the scenario, as I say, hopefully in kind of a easy to understand for the business. and then moved into the breakdown of source, event, and consequence. And I guess one of the interesting aspects of the conversation was potentially there's two events here with two different sources. So you've obviously got the external malicious attacker, whether that's criminal or state-sponsored, might be either, but that's the unauthorized access to the system. But potentially there's a source, non-malicious one, presumably, around the lack of patching, a lack of fixing something that had been identified. So whether that was ineffective or kind of an accidental source, which meant that there was a vulnerability there to be exploited. And then consequences of regulatory fines, unexpected costs through both offering credit protection, all that kind of stuff, but also subsequently the vast sums they've invested in security after the breach. And obviously reputational damage.
Yeah, I like the angle that you've taken with the two sources there, and it's the kind of thing where I think this can be quite useful in kind of giving you that structure to kind of go back and think over something and go, actually, you know, there's a few things here, and actually, like you say, if they've the kind of the events that can occur because you've got lax patching, or you're not promptly dealing with vulnerabilities that you find on your network, for example, are factors that increase the likelihood that an external malicious actor might be able to, like you say, exploit your a weakness and gain unauthorized access to a system. So I think that's quite a it's a good use of it.
Anybody else? Unless, is there anything that I've missed from the others in breakout room 2?
No, I think that's good. I wasn't in breakout 2, but I was in breakout 1. This is Luis. While looking at this, I was wondering whether it would make sense to do these risk statements more like using Gherkin. So you have a precondition. The internal source it's a precondition. So given ineffective asset management and vulnerability management, then the action when an attacker exploits a 10 CVSS score vulnerability in your exposed website that you didn't patch, then you have that's the event, then the consequence. So it might make sense to express this more like in the Gherkin statement, in which you separate the preconditions from the event itself, and then the consequence.
Yeah, it's an interesting, like you say, there are other ways to kind of refer back, and I guess where I was talking about chaining things together, that's kind of a very similar approach there. I guess the interesting thing that you've pulled out there is the idea of preconditions, and kind of these are the things that must have occurred or must be present in order for the event to occur. Phil looks like he wants to say something.
There's probably two ways you could look at that. Either you could treat a failure of a security process as an event in its own right. So you could say that the failure of patching was an event caused by a non-malicious, ineffective internal member of staff that led to an information breach caused by an external malicious. So you could chain the events. The other way to think about it is in the risk universe, we talk about risk factors. So things that make events more or less likely, and you might consider, you know, the time from patch identification to patch application being a factor rather than necessarily an event in its own right.
Yeah, cool. Okay, right. Did we end up with anyone in breakout room 3?
Yes,
we did. Go on.
So we spent time just focusing on the scenario itself. So we arrived in the end of external malicious actors, including organized cyber criminals and malicious hackers, and to a lesser extent, nation states and hacktivists, exploits known technical vulnerabilities on public-facing systems to gain access to sensitive customer data records, resulting in a catastrophic data breach. A large-scale data breach, obviously there'll be an organizational sort of specific threshold here. We've said 10,000 records, could result in widespread disruption to business and customer access to services, reputational damage manifesting in the loss of share price and customs, legal costs, and potentially hefty regulatory fines.
Cool. I think, can you just double check, Cam, that when the slide that I've got open doesn't have any of that on, but you've obviously got a lot
so
of work
it does, but we incorporated elements.
Okay, fine. Yeah, if you can, as I move on, if you can just make sure that it kind of there as a scenario, because we're going to share all the outputs at the end of the session. That'd be grand. Thank you very much. Who was in breakout room 4? Was anyone in 4? Did anyone have a go at the environmental harm of a disaffected employee and sewage works?
I don't know if the same happened to other people, but I was originally on room 4. I was there for 2.5 minutes talking with someone else, and then we were brought into other rooms.
Right,
so we had a start. At least I don't know if anyone else then kept on going, but we changed rooms in the middle. We were changed from rooms in the middle.
Not to worry then. We'll skip over. We'll skip over 4. I've got the last one while I was sat waiting for everyone to come back. The German steel mill cyber attack. So it was back in December 2014, I think. The one of the German intelligence agencies announced that there'd been an attack on a steel mill that caused some catastrophic damage. So we tried to write this out as a scenario. So safety critical hacker control systems. An employee opens a targeted spear phishing email with malicious attachment. The software exploit will give a sophisticated attacker access to our network where they can collect other information such as credentials that give them access to the control software governing our smelting process. If the process is changed, it may become unsafe and require us to shut down the furnace. So hopefully that's expressed that in a way that where you're talking to other operational or business colleagues, they'd kind of understand a bit more about what was going on. Obviously believed to be state sponsored. They referred to it as being an APT group. The events involved phishing, software exploits, and stolen credentials, presumably to gain an initial foothold and then to pivot around the network. And consequences, obviously safety failure, business disruption, and unplanned costs that go with shutting down those kind of big industrial processes and restarting those. So yeah, hopefully that you found as a kind of useful exercise. I appreciate it's a bit of throwing you all in at the deep end and telling you to make use of it, having had a very brief kind of 20-25 minute introduction to it. What I was going to suggest is that we take a short break, and it's almost 3 o'clock now, isn't it? Amazing how time flies. Let's say 10 past 3. We will continue, give everyone a chance to grab a drink and any other comfort that they require. Sorry, Louis, go on.
Have some break and come up with some questions.
Yeah, and then when we come back, we'll talk through 3 more use cases. So bow tie diagrams, risk coverage, and a little bit on graphs as well. So yeah, speak to you in 10 minutes.
Robin, only question is live streaming, because 10 minutes live streaming will be just, I cannot pause it.
Okay.
Do you want to show or just make something during this 10 minutes when others are...
Or just leave that screen you've got currently on.
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. And then if anyone is watching the live stream, they'll know when to be back for.
Cool. Thank you.
All right.
So just 3 minutes left before we start the second part of our session.
Yep, will be 2.5 minutes, I make it.
Yes. We should have some timer here showing how much time is remaining.
Oh, I've got that, don't worry. Don't worry. Keeping track of where we are.
Yeah, and yes.
Just having a look back up the chat while we're waiting for people to rejoin. I like Avi's suggestion of risk stories, like user stories, but for risk. Yeah, I think that's kind of where we're trying to get to with slightly richer kind of risk scenarios.
But always the risks that you cannot predict or never could come on your mind is the worst. Because if you create already risk story, then already you are almost there.
Okie doke. Right, let's restart, shall we? I hope
Sure.
everyone's had a good had a chance to have a comfort break and get any other refreshments they might need. I appreciate that 2 hours is quite a long time to be to be paying attention.
This
Thanks,
was
Alan.
very brave because this is remote session and giving people break, might be they will not come back.
I think we've there are a couple of people who haven't, but that's all right. They can also, there's going to be lots of people who choose to watch online. So yeah. Right, okie doke. So welcome back. 3 more use cases that we want to spend a bit of time. Thanks, Mario. Yeah, still here. Running through. So bow tie diagrams, risk coverage, and also a bit on graphs as well that Petra hopefully is still around and going to give us a hand with. She's been looking at it from a glass wall perspective and some of their incidents and applying it there. So without further ado, we'll jump into some bow tie diagrams. So these are popular in the kind of safety and hazard analysis kind of disciplines, particularly popularized in oil and gas as a sector for looking at hazards there. They provide a way to visualize a risk scenario and explore what barriers or security controls in InfoSec lingo are in place, both kind of pre and post boom of an event. And So, you know, what can help reduce or eliminate the threat from causing the event in the first place, and what measures can help to reduce or mitigate the consequences stemming from the event. This diagram's from a page on the Civil Aviation Authority website, actually, and they've got quite a good overview if you want to find out a bit more about bow tie diagrams and how you can use those. We're not going to cover that in huge detail today, but yeah, the links on the slides there, you can follow that. So we've already got a lot of these components in our taxonomy. So risk scenarios map quite nicely to the event in the center of the bow tie. The sources and events are, and I suppose this covers a little bit where Louis was asking about Gherkin models and preconditions and things like that. The things that need to be chained together leading up to that scenario being realized, and then obviously the consequences on the right-hand side. So we're going to just step through an example here. And build up some of the controls and barriers. So we've got our hacktivists that are going to be responsible for a supplier information breach, and that forms the kind of the boom, the event, if you like, the loss of customer data, and then stemming from that, there'll be some regulatory fines because it's personal information that they're taking. And this is a relatively simple way of visualizing this, but then we can start to apply some of those barriers or the security controls and where they fit in place. So potentially we've got multi-factor authentication implemented, and that's going to prevent them being able to reuse credentials that they found from previous breaches. We haven't got any kind of digital risk intelligence that might tell us whether credentials are being compromised. Maybe our organization doesn't have a SIEM in place, but that's the kind of control that we'd expect to see to be able to monitor what's going on. And maybe ideally we'd have a lock and change playbook from an IR perspective. So looking at this from maybe it's someone being able to gain access to a customer services portal and view customer records, for example. So we've done a good job and we've got some MFA on there, but there are some other bits there that we're missing. And then on the other side, we've done a data protection impact assessment. That's been completed, and that will help when it comes to some of those regulatory fines, because we have demonstrated that we're taking things seriously and what we should be putting in place. Maybe we've got a kind of early stage instant response process. It's not as mature as we like, but there's a kind of couple of controls there, and you can start to visualize where those controls sit and whether, you know, the kind of level of confidence or the effectiveness of those controls, both before the scenario manifests and also what's going to help reduce the severity of it afterwards. Hopefully that's all making sense so far. Phil, go on.
Yep. So I just thought I'd say bow tie diagrams are a very common what's called barrier diagram. So, you know, what sits between a threat and a harm. They're used in safety all over the place. They get a lot more complicated, so you can end up having events and risks that fall off of barriers, so off of the controls, to say what happens and how could they fail. But they're also very useful in that the controls left of boom are telling you how likely your controls are to stop it from occurring in the first place, whereas your mitigations right of boom tell you when it happens, how do I limit the damage? And my experience has been that actually I very rarely used to separate out my controls and mitigations like that, and it's very useful to understand if you're over focusing in one particular area.
Yeah, I agree. I think that kind of understanding what you're doing to help prevent and what you're doing to help respond and recover from an event is a really important way to look at it. And sometimes people can get a bit caught up on one particular side of the picture, and actually by visualizing it like this, you can see where there are where you might have gaps or where there are areas to improve. And being honest with yourself, I mean, here we've modeled them with a kind of red, amber, green kind of, you know, are they present? Do we think they should be there or not? It's quite a good way of kind of stepping through that particular scenario. And as Phil says, they can get a bit more complicated, and this is also an example of where you might get some things chained together. So, you know, here we've got criminals might exploit a software vulnerability that may result in the loss of customer data. We've got phishing there. The phishing, going back to the German steel mill example that we were talking about before the break, might be the thing that leads to a vulnerability being exploited, and all of those things. So exploiting vulnerability might be mitigated by patching. Maybe you've got an STLC that would help address vulnerabilities in bespoke software that you're writing. Again, SIEM and WAF and those sorts of things. On the phishing end of things, filtering, awareness programs, SIEM, you know, things to help detect and block. You know, what's your playbook and how are you dealing with those effectively, are all things that can help left, and then right. You know, we've got more consequences here. So it's not just regulatory fines. There might be reputational damage. And actually, if this is a supplier that's providing this information, this service to you, it might be, you know, they may be processing your data on your behalf. It may be a scenario where you actually end up, the consequence is that the loss of that supplier, that you need them to, you know, it's untenable for them to continue your business relationship. And actually thinking in those terms, like, well, you know, do we know who an alternative supplier might be, and, you know, how effective is our supplier onboarding process if we needed to pretty rapidly move from one to another because we realise that they just have some pretty fundamental problems with the way that they're handling our data, for example. So it gives you quite a rich way to look at these sorts of things. I can see a couple of notifications on the chat. Phil, are there some questions there that be worth covering, or you're on mute?
As usual. There's a discussion going on with Cameron's talking about how they're effectively using bow tie diagrams already.
Cool, awesome, good work. Yeah, so that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, kind of around bow tie diagrams. Like I say, it also kind of reminds you that you can have multiple of these things together. We've kind of split out these, but criminals obviously are responsible for 2 of those, and you can see all of your different sources, how they map to different events. You might end up with quite a few of these kind of staggered along, and then maybe there's some controls between them, for example, and you can visualize it on that kind of the attack path there, and yeah, what barriers you have along the way to help prevent those events from occurring and the scenario being realized. So yeah, good to hear that that people are already using that kind of approach. I think it's quite a powerful way to explore particular scenarios and the controls that are there. It can often be a lot more effective than your kind of traditional risk assessment where you've got gross risk and then, hey, we've implemented these controls and therefore this is the net risk. Uses the same information, but I think this aids communication and discussion with the rest of the business well. Anyone got any questions or anything they want to add on bow tie diagrams?
I do, if I may, Robin.
Yeah.
So, as mentioned, I've been using these to some extent within the business at the moment. But whilst that we're just exploring different ways that we might be able to load in data into these from our SOC or you know, control statuses to almost help with the calculations around the likelihood. I was just curious to see if you've seen that done really, and if so, how it was achieved.
So we've got an example coming up in a minute. So yeah, great question. And obviously, if you're able to automate some of these so that it's easier and less time consuming, then that's great. I guess it depends on the level of scenario that you're talking about. If you've rolled something up to a really high level, kind of a kind of board level scenario, overarching scenario, working out all the things that kind of permeate through to that might be more difficult to automate, but specific scenarios relating to individual systems, for example, yeah, that should be a relatively easier thing to sort of start to pull those things together. Phil has his hand up and is on mute.
I am aware that a surprisingly large bank has built what they call Bayesian networks in order to take what we call in the risk universe risk factors and combine them in ways that can drive likelihood models and consequence models sitting underneath the risks. It wouldn't be that hard to do a similar thing around the controls into the bow ties. What I will say is there's a couple of risk tools out there that let you draw these things, not many. So an awful lot of this is, manual at this point, and there's a lot of opportunity here for us, I think, to develop the tools that will make it easier to use.
There's also some really good discussion going on in the chat that I'll just recap. So Alan's suggesting that there must be a high degree of commonality between organizations at this kind of macro level, and does it lend itself to open source exemplar bow ties? I think that's a great idea. That's the kind of like, this is what good looks like. Yeah, also talk of like an open library of risks as well, and I guess that's a kind of maybe where we end up taking some of these, and yeah, welcome a lot of the yeah, any contributions to helping to develop this further. Hey Louis, and I'm guessing it's Louis' son. Have you got a question for us?
No, not really. My son was just saying hi to everyone.
Not you. I want to know if your son's got a question. They've always got interesting questions.
Yeah, well, I think his most pressing question was how to get the fire behind us. The question has been answered.
It's all fine. It's all fine.
Not calling emergency.
Cool. Okay. Right. So right, we'll crack on. So we've got some time for some more Q&A at the end. So just the one slide on the kind of risk coverage use case. So by having these in a kind of structured format, it does allow you to decompose and compare different risks, so between statements or between different systems or between different business units, for example. Yeah, in this example, CISO was translating their top 10 risk scenarios into a coverage map. So they've got the, you can see there the sources, the events, the consequences all mapped out and shaded in where they've got coverage or not. And they were able to compare what was being presented up to the board, spot the gaps, in this case, hacktivists and ransomware. And so you're able to kind of use it as a checklist for risk identification, stop trying to hold absolutely everything in your head all at once. And yeah, it's also quite useful, and please don't kill me, for IT auditors, for example, as you know, providing a basis for check and challenge as to yeah, whether you've got the right kind of coverage, whether you've thought about the right sorts of things. So yeah, you can generate these kind of coverage maps out of it. You can just use them as simple checklists, and yeah, may have some audit use. Does that all make sense? Anyone got any questions or comments on that before we move on?
No, that sounds fine.
Cool. A few comments there about I think using it with FAIR, for example. It's so explicitly we're trying to say this is just at the identification layer, so not going into analysis or evaluation at all. And obviously things like FAIR have cover a little bit of all of those components, but obviously the kind of emphasis is on the analysis piece. We've approached this from a broader identification purpose, and deliberately not tried to tie it to a particular methodology per se, so that people can use it with whatever approach or tool they've got to help them develop statements and scenarios. Yeah, I think that's it from the chat, isn't it? So one of the other things that we've been exploring and thinking about here, and Petra, are you still around? Have you? I know
yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you're still here as well. Cool.
I'm here.
So one of the other things that we've been exploring is the possibility of using this with other vulnerability and incident data in a graph format to help improve people's understandings of those. So we've got a couple of slides here that, including a few of our thought process while Petra and I were going through. So Petra, do you want to talk a little bit about the graphs and the work you've done? And then obviously after these two, we've got the ones that you've actually done based on incidents from Glasswall?
Yeah, so we were talking how we could integrate this and possibly like maybe even automate all of it. And in Glasswall we already have like we use Jira for a lot of things to help build graphs, to analyze data. So in this scenario, we took an incident that we had, and we were looking at how we could possibly incorporate this in Oisru. And this is a little brainstorming session that Robin and I had. So this was the first, basically this was an incident where you had a basic exposed on a website. And then we were kind of thinking about, where is this, the source, where is the event, where are the consequences? So we had, if you see the graph is actually a representation of Jira. So you have the links on the arrows. So you have links like facts, you have links like is created by, it has incident manager, has risk, has is vulnerability of. And we identified a risk, which was like a risk 6 here in the graph. And we thought maybe, if we can kind of try and connect the dots here. So that we could possibly create new issues in Jira, new projects, so that we could incorporate all of this into Oisru and make risk identification much easier, and then therefore put it into a risk register. So if you go on to the next slide, Robin. So this was the other kind of brainstorming thing that we thought, how to connect the dots. One was putting, the risk actually as a something that happened before the event. And then, we had the event, which was like explosion. So if you go on to the next slide, Robin, and you'll see it a little bit prettier.
I was going to say, just to not to label the point too much, but I think this was a really interesting bit where we were talking about how in project management terms, right, you have risks and issues, and in InfoSec we have risks and incidents, and not really an incident is the manifestation, the realization of a risk, and so actually by considering them as two sides of the same coin, you could actually start drawing up a lot here. So if you've, as part of your risk assessment, you've identified all the different potential consequences of that risk scenario, then if you ever have an incident that's tied to that scenario, you understand from a response perspective what harms and what consequences you should be trying to mitigate, as well as technically what remediations you should be trying to apply. So that was quite a cool, I think, byproduct of trying to stitch these together.
Yeah, so I have now the graph. I've taken another incident here to actually give you a nicer representation of it all. But actually this was the same incident which we initially thought it was a different one, because in one side we had keys exposed on a website, on another side we had keys exposed in GitHub, but then we realized these are actually the same keys. So this is actually the same incident, but we kind of granulated the risks a little bit on the right side, and therefore you have like risk 6, 7, and 8 now. And this is where we need to separate, the sources, events, and consequences here. I'm not sure why I put D. It's SEC. Okay, must have been very late at night. Okay, and then
partly it from either of us to have been working on the slides today,
and therefore, we thought we could link possibly the consequence, which was an unplanned cost in this scenario because we had to deter resources from other sides. And we would link that to the incident itself. And we had the incident itself, which was actually an event. So to complete this graph in Jira, for example, to say how it works in practices, we would create another issue in Jira, which would be an event. Actually, it would be a project, and it would be an event. And then that event would tie to the incident. And then we would create another one, which would be a source, which also would tie then to the event itself. And also, as I said, we had the consequence, which would be a third kind of project issue in Jira. And the consequence would be like, is consequence of, or you could tie it to the risk itself, like has consequence. So therefore, if we have all that data in Jira, we could create even more complex graphs based on this that would not just tie, we would have the risk, we would have the incident, and we would have all the elements of the risk here as well from Oisru. And this is the other option that we said, that was the second drawing. So same thing, but this time we would actually tie the risks to the event like this, to the incident, which would actually be equal to an event. And then we would have a separate source and a consequence. So the risk will be kind of the predecessor of the incident itself. This is our kind of second option. So I was actually wondering if anyone has any suggestions. What do you think of this way of kind of implementing it and kind of storing it as a, in practice, like using a software like Jira, and then after that making graphs out of it. So I was wondering if anyone has experience with that, or if they have any suggestions.
So one of the things I have been thinking about, and I think is a huge opportunity, is that once we have the relationships between sources, events, and consequences mapped, and we use consistent language to describe them, if we go through our entire register and apply that to the statements in the risk registers, we can then start looking where there are interdependencies. So assuming that the risks in the register are not all independent of each other, but overlap. And where those overlaps exist, where are the opportunities to invest in a control which attacks 5 or 6 different risks? I think there's huge opportunity there to use a graph to do that, rather than a risk register, a risk graph.
Yeah, and if you have everything in Jira and you can use Jupyter, it will create the graphs for you. So all you need to do is just look at the graphs and make your own conclusions from it, which is a great tool.
Apply a bit of human ingenuity. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there, and especially if you're decomposing it into particular systems or business units, and how those manifest within a particular part of the business and relate back to an overall risk. Cool. Did anyone else have any other questions or thoughts on graphs?
Robin,
yeah.
Okay, hi. The thought occurred that there is the opportunity in graphs to look at interdependencies and kind of systemic risk behaviors and kind of solve that big kind of contagion risk problem and all the stuff that we talk about in cyber. But the other area where I think that we've got a big challenge where it's different to physical risk is the dynamism and the time between risk and opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And Phil's mentioned it yesterday, that idea of kind of control friction and opportunity cost as a result of controls. Risk graphs, I guess, have got that potential to do the thing which everybody always talks about, a risk and opportunity register. But the opportunities are always a little bit, they're the risk guys coming up with them, and they're never really a proper analysis of opportunity. So
doom and gloom.
The graphs potentially give us an opportunity and a chance to look at that dynamic relationship between risk and opportunity.
Yeah, you could certainly you could have in your graph items that are your business objectives, or you could decompose your strategy into it and how those relate to different strategic objectives and or particular business activities and that kind of thing. I think there's a quite a powerful kind of way to describe relationships when you start doing it on a kind of not industrial in a bad way, but a better scale than is afforded to you, like as a one-to-one relationship in a spreadsheet, for example. Being able to map and graph these things together.
There's a interesting thing with opportunity. While I think there's uncertainty around opportunity, I don't think risks and opportunities are the same thing. And sometimes you hear people talking about upside risk, and I'm not sure that's quite the right thing. And the reason being is you walk into an opportunity knowing what you want, and then you're managing the uncertainty to get it. Whereas with a risk, you know, I'm sure everybody's had this conversation with a stakeholder. How much risk do you want to take? None. That's not realistic. How much risk do you want to take? Well, how much do I have to take? Well, how much do you want to take? You know, and because ultimately no stakeholder sets up a business to take risk, they sets up business to take advantage of opportunity. And there are relationships between risk and opportunity, but they aren't the same thing. I think there is a huge opportunity to do control rationalization. You know, the fact that we might have delivered 65 different tools into the environment, but when we look at the bow tie diagrams for our top 10 risks, and we might realize that actually we are over protecting risks from occurring and under mitigating risks once they've happened. And actually we may be able to find ways to make the whole thing cheaper and easier with a bit more confidence than just turning something off, which I know everybody in security hates thinking about.
Yeah, I think optimization of that kind of control environment is another one, and that, like you say, lends itself quite nicely from bow tie diagrams and kind of approaching things in that, you know, these things and consequences on the other side, and you know, the event in the middle. Cool. Well, we're rapidly approaching 22, which is the point at which I said that we'd probably get on to doing a quick bit of questions and feedback. I know we've taken a few as we've been going along, so maybe this is an opportunity for us to ask a few more questions of you all as participants here. So, you know, does it make sense? Are there things that are missing? How did you find putting it into practice? Are there any particular use cases that we've discussed that you think are particularly exciting, or other things that you've come up while you've been thinking about it? Or just questions about any of the content as well.
Sarah, Luis, and Mario were having discussion in the chat, so maybe they can they want to summarize something or add something. I don't know if you want also, or you want to recap.
Is this regarding the ENISA framework, the ENISA taxonomy? Sorry.
Yeah. I see some discussion going.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, you need to categorize threat events or threat sources. And ENISA, the European Information Security Agency, has a great source of threats categorized in a very wide spectrum. And there's a reduced version for financial institutions, I think. In my case, working for an automotive company, I have increased it with automotive-specific part of the taxonomy, or even unfortunately had to make some things redundant because the colleagues couldn't find the appropriate threads where they were looking for it. But it's a great place to start with if you want to categorize things. And something that I saw on the graph that Petra showed was that the vulnerability is there. So there has to be a means of exploitation. There has to be something to be exploited by an attacker, right? Else you have you might always have a threat, but no risk because there's no probability of occurrence. So that is something that I kind of missed in the slideshows in which we worked in the breakout rooms. You only had like you had the thing, but that's what I was saying, that Gherkin could help, because you need to have the preconditions. So you have black powder, your vulnerability, you have fire, your attacker. When you put them together, you have fireworks. You cannot have fireworks just with fire or just with black powder. You need both of them to come in contact. Yep. Even if they are close, if they do not come in contact, you might not get the fireworks or the boom. So that's how I usually explain it to my stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the reason why we haven't got vulnerabilities in there at the moment, just the events, and we've kind of in a way glossed over those preconditions, are because I think it was Simon who was saying, you know, the world's moving very quickly when it comes to cyber, and so being able to categorize and put all of those vulnerabilities in place, the permutations there, what we've assumed is that vulnerability may exist. and that therefore the event can occur. And then it becomes, how do you, what other controls can you put in place around that, rather than needing a specific class of vulnerability as part of the chain together of the statement. At its very most bare bones, Phil and I whittled it down to being, risk basically being event and consequence. But obviously you can expand out how you want to construct your risk and include lots of other components, and vulnerability is one of those.
I'd also point to the bit of the framework at the moment which is bolted on and we need to find a better use for, which is the risk factors.
Yeah.
So risk factors tell you, if you have more of something, your likelihood of occurrence has gone up. If you have less of something else, the level of harm that will occur goes down. They are somewhat specific to the type of event and the type of environment you're in. And they may not be mechanistic. So the difference between 1.4 million vulnerabilities and 400,000 vulnerabilities is not, a million clicks on the risk score. Because once you've got more than about 200 remotely exploitable vulnerabilities, you're probably already at the most vulnerable you're going to be. So there is a thing with risk factors where we need to consider if they're going up, if they're going down, and how that influences. But ultimately, I would say that's part of the analysis process to understand. So this isn't a vulnerability identification process, it's a risk identification process. So this isn't about analyzing a risk, it's about what risks should we be thinking about, if that makes sense. I see Alan in the chat has just asked about risk aggregation. So I think this helps. I think once you have a common language around events and consequences, you can start making better statements around the total risk that you've got. But again, if you're talking about aggregation, you're talking about aggregating likelihood and impact. That's an analysis job. That's not an identification job. And I'm quite keen to keep the risk universe separate from the analysis method because there's so many of them and everybody's got their favorite.
Yeah, I think the approaching it with a bit more structure, it does support that, because you can actually compare. Well, first off, you can identify whether the two scenarios that you're looking at are the same, in inverted commas, whether they're related and whether they're the sorts of things that you can aggregate up simply, or requires a bit more complex analysis, or whether in fact they're actually duplicates of each other, or kind of a kind of parent-child relationship, and how you go about, can you just add them up, or is one a subset of the other, or how do you? It gives you a structured way to approach that. Okay. Sorry, Cam, you were going to say something.
Yeah, nothing in relation to that. I was just saying that I read through the universe, part of my my MSc I'm doing at the moment, and I must say I just think it's excellent. I think you guys have pulled in the best bits of the wider ISRM frameworks, while streamlining them and covering the gaps that are present within them. And I think the bow ties, in my mind, they are the stepping stone between qualitative and quantitative approaches, and I think offer that great link to change the culture as you move from one to the other. I think they're brilliant. So yeah, excellent job, guys. I think it's fantastic, and just more. Want to see more of it. It's great.
Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to hear. And yeah, if you want to get involved, then yeah, it's all out there. We've got a link to the GitHub repository on the website, and yeah, anyone who wants to help us take it further, then pull requests and contributions gratefully received. Thanks.
So let us answer Mario question in chat about the risk titles. Phil, might be you can take it, and then we can recap.
Yeah, sorry, I was just typing an answer. So risk titles. So my experience of risk titles is that they tend to be a shortened version of a scenario in order to make it readable on one line in an Excel spreadsheet, or some other Excel spreadsheet like GRC tool. I think if you are overwhelmed with risks such that you can only work at the single sentence level, the risk statements make this all a lot more readable, but you probably just need more people or automation. You might also want to do the process of looking at several hundred risks and saying to yourself, am I just looking at many instances of the same risk? Is it just the same risk in lots of different places in my scope? And I think, you know, the nice thing about using a common, consistent language is that you may well find that, you know, you drop down to about 50 risks you really care about. They just happen to be, it just happens to have instances all over the place.
And where we'd actually walked through one of the examples, actually, we did have a, I guess what you'd call the title in blue, and then the broader kind of narrative afterwards. So once you've got the detail, it's easy to summarize it, but at least you've got the detail there to wheel out and to not have to do every time. If you've boiled everything down just to titles and that's what you've got to go on, every time someone asks you a question about it, you've got to kind of concoct the scenario and kind of work out what it is, and kind of there's a lot of mental energy there. Whereas if you've got that in a kind of in your back pocket to kind of go with it, then you know, you can be more consistent in the way that you communicate risk across the business, be it to up to the board or other people in business or technology functions. And I think actually one of the things that makes a good scenario is if you can use it for all those different audiences. If you're having to kind of reconstitute in different ways for different audiences, you're probably not articulating what the scenario is very well. Does that make sense, Marion?
I'm just going to add one of my customary little rants. Risk registers are a really bad idea, terrible idea.
Thanks.
Generally, I'm just the interesting thing is the reason we do risk analysis is to be able to do risk evaluation, to make a decision, which we then take actions on, or we then monitor something to see if it gets bad enough that we need to take actions on. But ultimately, it's about supporting somebody to make a decision, how much money to spend, how much time to take, whether to look at it or not. I've never seen someone make a decision because of a spreadsheet full of risks. What happens is a bunch of people get in a room and they talk about a risk and they try to understand what's going on. And then somebody sort of makes a judgment on, is this bad enough that we should deal with it? But my general sense of risk registers is they lose information all over the place. So you go into a risk analysis with loads of data. How many vulnerabilities have we got? How many systems? How many records? How did that look last year? What are the regulators? You know, all these data points. And then you go to the register and say, and this is going to be high, and this is going to be medium, and it's a risk of data loss, and it's a high medium. And then when somebody comes 6 months later to look at the register, assuming they were going to make a decision on that basis, they don't have any of the assumptions or data points available that you had when you called it a high medium. So they can't, all they can do is take it at face value. They can't rejudge what that means in their current world. And I think risk registers are a terrible idea for that. And unless we're capturing the data and the assumptions behind the risks when we analyze them, what's the point of keeping a list? But anyway, that's my normal customary rant.
Cool. So yeah, there's definitely opportunity for people to capture more information and keep it more readily available for them to make better decisions. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for all of your time today. I appreciate that. Yeah, 2 hours is quite a long time, so thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for participating, all the questions, the feedback, and hopefully you found it interesting and useful, and something that you can take away and make use of. So thank you very much, and also thank you to Phil and Petra for their help in putting together this presentation. And don't worry, I've not forgotten we need to do a summary now on the end, right?
Yes, thank you.
But I guess if everyone else doesn't want to hear me recap, if no one else has any questions, then you can drop off. and I'll give you some time back. Otherwise, you can listen to me recap the session for others. Okay, so today's session, Thursday at 2 o'clock, we started was on the Open Information Security Risk Universe with me, Robin Oldham, Phil Huggins, who's not going to wave, but he's over there, and Petra as well from last one. Thank you very much for your help. We had a few objectives of our session. We were going to introduce people to a project that we've been working on called the Open Information Security Risk Universe. We're going to get participants to apply that to previous incidents and test their understanding of it. And then we were going to explore a couple of use cases. We talked a little bit about bad risk registers and bad risk statements and what those look like, and the problems that that can lead to, and the importance of adopting a more modern way to identify risk and how risk universes can support that. We introduced people to the Open Information Security Risk Universe, and where that fits in a risk assessment process. So as part of identifying risk before you get to analysis and evaluation. And that these scenarios and the components that you have comprise of sources, events, and consequences. There are supplementary bits that you can look at within the Oisru framework that help define the frequency factors that may make something more or less likely to occur, and the severity factors that make it more or less likely to have significant consequences for your business. So we talked through a little bit of the use cases about writing good risk statements and drafting risk scenarios, and then we went on to talk about creating bow ties and checking coverage and graphing. And the difference between a risk scenario, which is a broader narrative to help communicate an example to others within the business, and a risk statement, which is a shorter, more succinct factual purpose. We had everyone break into groups, and they completed an exercise here that you can see, taking a historic event and reversing that into a scenario and a statement applying the framework, and we gathered people's feedback on what that looked like. Then we talked a little bit about bow tie diagrams and how we can use the Oisru framework to construct those, some of them being potentially quite a bit more complicated, and the barriers or security controls that you might put in place to help prevent an event from occurring in the first place, or to help mitigate the consequences afterwards. We talked a little bit about risk coverage and how you can use the framework as a bit of a checklist and an aide-memoire to work out whether you've identified all the relevant risks for your particular assessment, or where you're presenting it to, for example, the board or other audiences, and how it might be useful for IT auditors and provide a basis for check and challenge. Petra did a great job of talking through a couple of graph examples that we've got, and how you might apply those if you're already graphing things like incidents that you can see here, how those things might feed together, and how you might be able to get more value out of those. Here was a working example, and where we started to link together, particularly the consequences, if you've identified those as part of the risk, back to an incident, and help close the loop and provide you a bit more data for future assessments. And yeah, that was pretty much the session. We had really good involvement from people. We gathered people's questions and feedback, and we'll be putting that on the page on the Open Security Summit website. And once again, just like to say a big thank you to everyone for their time in and efforts today in participating, and to Phil and Petra for taking part in presenting as well.
Thank you, everyone. So stopping